Hello, hello, and welcome to Shit You Wished You Would Have Learned in Grad School. I'm your host, Jennifer Agee, licensed clinical professional counselor. And with me today is Kari Gregory, licensed clinical professional counselor. She runs a private practice in Kansas City and specializes in the area of OCD. She specializes in treating anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorders, and other related disorders. Kari is amazing. She's done trainings for me before. Not only does she specialize in anxiety disorders and OCD, she's also been trained by the Behavioral Therapy Training Institute. She's a member of the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, and she sits on the OCD Special Interest Group committee. So we are very fortunate to have her today, and I just want to welcome you.
Well, thank you. That was quite an introduction. I hope I live up.
You will, and you do all the time. So, Kari, I wanted to have you on today because it's very hard sometimes for therapists to be able to tell the difference of whether or not they're working with generalized anxiety disorder, maybe just a specific phobia, or if we're going into the category of OCD, because there's different subtypes. So thank you for coming on, and let's talk about it.
Sure. That's such a, it gets misdiagnosed and cross-pollinated all the time. It's really sort of difficult to tease this out if it's not your very typical presentation, right?
Right.
Somebody comes in with some very specific outward compulsions, you're going to know right away, check the box, it's OCD, or I'm afraid of spiders and I can't go outside in my yard. But rarely does it present quite so cut and dry and neat and clean like that, right?
Right. And in grad school, they make everything sound like it's going to come out. You are going to be so crystal clear on what's happening. Right. And the practice of that is just not true.
No. and what I think is often the case too, our clients aren't exactly sure what's going on with themselves. They might have their main presenting problem, and then not share a lot of like the behind the scenes and what's actually driving it. So what might look like panic is actually something deeper. And so, yeah, there's a lot of questioning and doing some functional analysis of behaviors to be able to tease out what might be the difference. Is this social anxiety? Is this agoraphobia? Is this OCD? Yeah.
So what are some of the hallmark characteristics of OCD that we need to be looking for? So let's start with the general, and then we can go a little more specific.
Sure. So I think what's really interesting is to identify that with OCD and related disorders, the powers that be who create the DSM, right? They moved that out of anxiety disorders with DSM-5 and created their own, group of disorders. So it's obsessive compulsive and related disorders and includes, skin picking, trichotillomania, hoarding, and I'm missing some, but that's okay. And the reason why they did that is because there are some factors of OCD that don't align with other anxiety disorders. And the main thing that's going to be the telltale sign is I'm having these thoughts that bother me, and I'm doing these compulsive behaviors in direct relation to those thoughts.
Okay.
Right? What gets tricky though, Jennifer, is that all anxiety disorders have compulsive behaviors associated with them.
Absolutely. And that has gotten me on more than one occasion. I know I've had to consult with you before and really had a eureka moment during one of your trainings where I realized something that I had been treating really did fall more accurately in the OCD category, but sometimes this stuff is sneaky.
Oh gosh, it can be incredibly sneaky. So going back to some of the signs that might be a little bit different, whether or not it's anxiety or OCD, from an OCD perspective, they moved it out of anxiety disorders because there's also additional emotional factors that can be at play, right? So anxiety isn't always the characteristically driven problem. Disgust is another big factor with OCD.
Wait a minute.
Just
Let's pause. Tell me about that disgust.
disgust. So I'm having a disgust reaction to a germ and or a situation and or a noise like misophonia, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but that's more of a disgust response than an anxiety response.
Okay.
Okay, and that's going to be quite different. Then there's just right. And with just right OCD, again, it's not an anxiety response that the person is dealing with, but it feels very, very off, and I cannot take that, right? So a little different than anxiety. And then this is, I think, kind of like hinting to, some of the additional, anyway, let me back up just a little bit. This was added in the 2005 or the 2013 DSM as well. Jealousy, retroactive jealousy, obsessional jealousy, this whole thing that really defines what's called relationship OCD. That can be another factor that's a little different than anxiety, but contributing to a lot of distress.
Okay. Whereas if you're not tuned into the signs, you could easily look at it and see maybe they're stuck in their grief process, or they're just more anxiously wired in general. And so then add that onto the ending of a relationship or not getting a job, and that's what's going on. So I'm glad that you're pointing that out.
Okay. And sorry, I got a little confused there in my talking. So there might be other factors at play. So being able to work with the client to understand, okay, we're feeling anxious, because I think that's one of our favorite go-tos as people. I'm anxious, right? And I almost see anxiety a lot of times as a secondary emotion to, okay, but what are you anxious about feeling? Are you anxious about feeling shameful? Are you anxious about grief? Are you anxious about jealousy? So we can tease out some of that in that. And then we're going to have compulsive behaviors that have an intensity behind them and have a ritualistic aspect to them. Like I mentioned, you're going to see compulsive behaviors in all anxiety disorders, but they're going to look and feel a little bit different than an OCD compulsion.
Okay, tell me about that.
Yeah. So again, it's ritualistic in nature, most likely. There are rules that will follow, whether or not they're really conscious rules. It's like, I know that I need to do this until it feels this way. It may or may not have a direct connection to the feared thought, right? So I'll use tapping, although I think if somebody's tapping, you might be able to identify that that's obsessive compulsive, but I'm going to tap to make sure that nothing bad happens to my child today at school, right? Like there's no connection there to the behavior and the child. There's also an urgency behind doing compulsions. If I don't do this, something bad is going to happen. And that doesn't usually exist alongside generalized anxiety compulsive behaviors. And we'll get into what those typically are in a minute. So those are some of the things too that you can ask about, like the function of these behaviors and what drives the need to do them. That can be helpful.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful point. One of the things that you mentioned is what feeling are they, what's underneath the anxiety. And sometimes I wonder when I'm talking with my clients about anxiety, what are you trying not to feel? Not just what's underneath that, but what is that anxiety helping you to avoid feeling?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you just hit nail on the head there with avoidance, right? That's the number one across the board anxiety compulsive behavior. Avoidance. There's three that all anxiety disorders are going to, I mean, there's probably more, but there's three that are a shared component, right?
Okay, tell us what they are.
Yeah, rumination. So the client is ruminating or worrying excessively, right? Rumination, avoidance, and reassurance seeking. So those three are really common across all anxiety disorders.
Mhm.
So they're asking, is this okay? Am I going to be okay? Are you okay? Or, there's some sort of reassurance going on. Definitely ruminating, and excessively so. And then avoidance behaviors. And that just makes your life very, very, very small. Because I'm going to avoid anything that might trigger that uncomfortable feeling in me.
Mhm. Great point. I've noticed with my clients that have OCD that reassurance seeking is really high. It's higher than with my generalized anxiety disorder clients.
Yes. And you can answer the question 6 ways to Sunday, and it's never quite enough to get that, okay, I feel good about this, right?
I think that's a great point to pause here on and make sure therapists take that in, because that is one of the things that you feel in the room or experience in the room that you realize something else might be going on here. And with experience and time and learning little tricks like this, you'll start to recognize and identify it sooner. But Carrie's absolutely right. If you offer reinsurance, if you offer logical mind to the fear-based thinking, and there's no budging there, right? It's then I'm going to ask you for reassurance in 3 different other ways.
Yes, that's exactly
You
right.
you might have something beyond generalized anxiety as well.
Yeah, I think that's really key, right? If
Mhm.
you're noticing that you're working with someone who is asking the same questions over and over again, okay, that might be a red flag. Or also, like, is never really focused on one thing. They jump around a lot. That's sort of content chasing. And that doesn't typically happen with a general anxiety disorder. I think another key point that I want to make with generalized anxiety versus OCD, the content is actually quite different as well.
Okay.
So the content for generalized anxiety is going to look more like everyday worries that most people worry about, right? Did I do a good job? And what if we get fired? What if my husband loses his job? What if my kids get sick? Like those sort of everyday concerns. It's just excessive in the amount of concern around it, right? And the level of worry and rumination that comes along with it.
Hmm.
The content of OCD feels a little bit more bizarre, feels a little bit more grandiose in its nature. What if I lose control and hurt someone? What if I lose control and hurt myself? What if I drive my car off a cliff? What if, more grandiose in nature, these are not everyday types of concerns. What if I'm not living my true life? What if I find out later my sexual identity is different than I thought it was? These are not everyday concerns,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
so the content can also give you a big clue as to what I'm dealing with, right?
So when you mention content chasing, what do you think the content chasing is trying to accomplish in the person's system?
Well, so if we think about like what the intrusive thoughts are doing, we're on high alert for our feared consequence, our catastrophic event, right? And so the way that I sort of conceptualize my OCD cases is there's a core fear, there's a core underlying concern, and a lot of it is usually more self-based than if you're dealing with other anxiety disorders. So what do I mean? Like it's a fear of either becoming someone you don't want to be, or how it's going to hurt your relationships or your way to relate with other people, right?
Mm.
And so because this fear is there, the content is sort of like you're primed to be looking at any situation that might exist that's going to threaten that.
Okay. It kind of reminds me a little bit of maybe the primal brain on steroids, right? Where our primal brain is scanning the environment for threat of danger, right? For our
Exactly.
survival of the species, if you will.
Yeah,
But
right,
it sounds
exactly.
like this is a really intensified version of that.
Right, exactly. And I talk to clients that way all the time. It's like, what is our brain meant to do? It's meant to keep us safe and solve problems. And then if you've got this obsessive compulsive component going on, well, anything is a possible problem that needs to be solved, and everything is a threat. So exactly. And so when you have your particular version of what that threat might be, and our brains love to make random associations, anything could be attacking that.
Okay. Those are good distinctions. What are some of the other things that, now here's where my hippie side comes out. And I know you know this about me. I'm like 60% hippie, 40% traditional, and it flip-flops sometimes. But what do you feel in the room? Do you notice a different feeling in the room when you're with clients who do struggle with OCD?
That's such a great question, because yes, you do.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I noticed that with
absolutely
lots
do.
of different diagnoses, a lot of times from what's trying to be pulled out of me, I
Yeah.
can often tell what I need to pay attention to.
And I don't know if I could pinpoint what that is that I experience, or that, you kind of notice, but yeah, it doesn't feel the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's one of those things, when you get enough experience, you'll usually know it when you feel it, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And you start just asking the questions, and then those, okay, yeah, now this is all coming together and making a lot of sense. Yeah.
Can you just quickly go over what are some of the different OCD subtypes, so that our brains are more scanned to think in general, not just specific to the things we've seen on TV or maybe were presented to us in a class in grad school? What are some of the different subtypes of ways that OCD comes out that we can maybe be thinking of if we notice a client is stuck?
Yeah. So I think this is really where maybe you don't get a good picture in grad school, because OCD does have a lot of dimensions to it, right? We get the classic contamination, hand washing, or the just right with things needing to be aligned correctly. So I think those most people are aware of, but those aren't even the most common, right? What I see a lot today, scrupulosity or moral OCD, and those go together. And so scrupulosity is going to look more at the religious aspect of what the person might be focused on, but then there's also a moral component that goes along with that. What if I offend God? And how does that make me a bad person? And then that can overgeneralize into, I have to be the best person I can be, which means I'm overly responsible for anything that happens to other people, to the point where, I'm in a bathroom cleaning up puddles because somebody might fall. And if I don't take care of that, then I've somehow offended. So it can get very deep.
That sounds like a very painful way to live.
It really is. It starts to take over every aspect, because you're overthinking every little detail of your life. How might this prove that I'm a bad person?
Oh, wow.
Right? So that one, I think, can get missed quite a lot. So that would be moral scrupulosity. Relationship, as I sort of touched on earlier, relationship OCD. And this has a lot of different manifestations. So this has a jealousy factor that can be attached to it, retroactive jealousy, which is a very hot thing, I think, on TikTok and social media right now. Sure. And that's getting hyper focused on the fact that the person that you love has had a past, and you can't really get over that. But it isn't generally about the person. It's about, well, what does that mean about you to be involved with a person who had these behaviors, who had these past lives and lovers, right? Again, it's very much a personal attack that on the self, the OCD is, right? It's not really about the other person. It's about, well, what does that end up meaning about me?
Okay.
And ultimately, how does that leave me without my connections? But relationship OCD can also look like, is this the right person? Am I with the right person? Do I know that I love this person? And these are all questions that, can sound pretty normal in relationships. So it's teasing out okay, so what does that mean if you aren't? And getting to, okay, is this bigger than just a normal relationship concern?
Okay. Yeah.
And then what are your behaviors that are following that
Mhm.
might be compulsive and excessive?
Okay.
I think what really also trips people up is the pure O aspect
Right.
of OCD. And there are
What's
even,
Puro?
yeah, okay, so
What's
pure O,
Puro?
which is a misnomer. It's not really just purely obsessional, but that just means that all of the compulsions that the person experiences are mental compulsions. So none of them are overt. I'm not hand washing, I'm not tapping, I'm not checking, I'm not doing anything else. I am only ruminating, creating patterns in my brain. Prayer can be a mental compulsion, but it's outside of like actually the religious aspect of it. It's like trying to get exactly just right so the bad thing doesn't happen. But all of it is just going on internally.
Okay, so
And
it's
so I
the
think,
internal manifestation of that anxiety trying to mitigate those feelings in
yes,
an internal way versus an external way.
exactly.
Okay.
Now, what I tend to find is that I've rarely seen pure O as pure O.
Okay.
You dig hard enough, you ask enough questions, you really analyze behaviors, and there are external compulsions going on as well. Maybe just not identified as what they are,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
That makes total sense. Yes.
Um, but that looks a lot like generalized anxiety disorder, because what are the compulsions with generalized anxiety disorder? Excessive worry and avoidance.
Yeah.
So there's nothing really external going on, but it's what happens when you have these thoughts. What happens? What do you feel like you need to be doing
I
in
think
order to
that's
mitigate?
this is another pause point. Therapists take what she just said in because this is a question you can add to your vocabulary. If you notice that you have a client that's presenting with generalized anxiety disorder, they don't have the external symptoms that you may see, like textbook OCD of,
Right.
the tapping or the aligning everything in the kitchen just right. But ask the questions that she just mentioned. I think that will be really helpful for you in being able to dig deeper to determine whether or not you need to go further along investigating whether or not it might be OCD or if you really do have a generalized anxiety disorder.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That's key, right? Like,
Mhm.
okay, well, when that thought occurs to you, what do you do? What do you feel like you have to do? Right.
Mhm.
And for generalized anxiety disorder, because like I said, there's not a ritualistic aspect, there's not necessarily an urgency that comes with it. It's really just more of a freeze response, if you will. And you're just stuck in rumination and you can't move until like maybe mentally you figured out what it is, you need to resolve in that moment. But it's the excessive worry is very different than maybe what else might be going on in an OCD brain, which might be, well, I'm praying and then I'm doing my list that makes me feel safe. And then I'm counting and right, like there might be a whole litany of behaviors that are going on to mitigate the thought that I just had.
Absolutely. Getting back to the different subtypes, the
Mhm.
one that tripped me up, one of my first big trip ups was around health anxiety.
Mhm.
And it was absolutely OCD when, zooming out, looking at it, getting some consultation. Why are we still stuck here? But I totally missed it. I gotta own that. But health anxiety is one of them as well. I want to put on people's radar screens because it got me good one time.
Mhm. Health anxiety is interesting too because it is its own diagnosis,
Hmm.
but the function is almost identical
Yeah.
to OCD, right? Because it's just it's like a subtype. I'm
Hmm.
focused on this one area, but I have all of these compulsive behaviors that are going along with it. And one thing that you really notice with somebody who's really dealing with health anxiety, be it somatization disorder or health related anxiety, they're not just going to the doctor. They've got all sorts of bells and whistles and tests that they're doing. And oh my gosh, every time I see a new device come on the market, I'm like, no, please.
And Google,
like,
Dr.
You have the
Google.
home EKG now. You have like that, right? And so identifying with a client, what all are you doing in order to make sure that you're healthy? Okay, now this is really looking like it's got that obsessive compulsive disorder or component to it.
Mhm. Do you find that most of your clients come in knowing that they have OCD
I
or
have a
not?
good mix. A good
Okay.
mix. I mean, a lot of people do find me because they are searching for an ERP provider or an OCD provider. And so, yes, I have probably the majority come in knowing that's what they're dealing with.
Mhm.
But even just this past week, I had a person start with me and for panic disorder. And yeah, after just discussion and understanding what we were dealing with, it's pretty clear that she also is struggling with OCD.
Yeah. Well, I find that that term has been thrown around so much, in part because of social media, TikTok, things of that nature.
Mhm.
People are diagnosing and labeling themselves without necessarily seeking a professional to do a proper diagnosis
Mhm.
to determine if that really genuinely is the issue or if there's something else going on. What are some of the things that you do in terms of testing or intake that help you know whether or not it is OCD?
So typically, I'm going to get what I need from my informal intake interview. And I have my list of questions, and they do include the things that we've talked about, right? Like when I'm asking about symptoms, I'm going to ask, okay, what's a trigger for that? And then walk me through what that looks like. What do you do directly after? So I'm getting a lot of background information in that way. I'm also going to ask about, like, OCD often is not something that starts out of the blue unless it's like a pandas or a pans. So I want to know the history. What
Right.
were they a worrier as a kid? And that is a question I also ask about for the family, because I'll ask about your family history. OCD also very much tied genetically. There's going to be another person in the family who's struggling. And even if I get, no, there's nobody who has that, I found a different way to ask that question that almost always gets me the right answer. Who
What
worries
is it?
in your family?
Who
Who in your
worries?
family is a worrier?
Okay.
Oh, Aunt so-and-so, or my mom, right? Dad. There's usually somebody who's a worrier that they can identify with. And even if there hasn't been this formal diagnosis, you know in your family who worries. And then it's like, okay, well, we probably do have a family history here. And then we can dig a little bit deeper. Some great tools, though, for people who, aren't as versed at just picking up these cues. So for early clinicians, the diamond is very, very good. I may have a copy of it here. It's a wonderful, and I think it's open sourced. I'm pretty sure it is. So it's the diagnostic interview for anxiety, mood, and OCD related disorders. And it's just a step-by-step, like, okay, let's just start checking off these boxes. Do you have these kinds of symptoms? So it's a really good tool for someone who isn't quite as well versed in diagnosing yet. And then there's also the Y box, which is sort of a gold standard tool for identifying and assessing severity of OCD. And
Y with the W, Y with the letter Y.
Y, Yale Brown
Oh,
obsessive compulsive scale is what it
got it.
stands for.
Okay,
So
good.
Y-B OCS. It's open sourced as well. And there's a scale on one aspect, but the other one is it asks the most common, and it's being updated because it's a bit outdated at this point, but the most common obsessions and compulsions that people struggle with. And this is great for people who are not well versed in it, because if we think about like coming in to see somebody for the first time and you have all of these scary, intrusive thoughts, most people don't share those, right?
Right. Good point.
Because if you're having a thought of what if I lose control and hurt myself, I'm not going to share that with anybody. I'm afraid they're going to put me away.
Right.
Right. Or they're going to come and take my kids because I'm afraid I'm having thoughts about harm. And so a lot of times, like, clients aren't sharing these types of things until either they feel more comfortable or they understand a little bit different about what they're struggling with. And so what the Y box can also do is normalize for them. So it starts asking a lot of questions. Do you ever have these types of thoughts, these types of thoughts? And it's like, oh, if it's on a chart, I must not be the only one who has them. Right?
Absolutely.
So
I know. I thought that when I
normalize.
filled charts out before, like check boxes before, I'm like, oh, that's normal. That must be normal to some people.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. So it does help normalize it, and it also helps open the conversation.
Okay.
Because we didn't get through all of the subtypes, but there's a lot of taboo type of thoughts that trigger people, and they're just not comfortable sharing those with anybody. They believe it's a character flaw that they have them. So.
Absolutely. Well, and I think this is bringing up the good point, which is our learning never ends as clinicians. No matter when you finish school, you will continue to learn. CEUs force you to, force you to do that, which is great. But take the time to follow your curiosity of interests, of things that are piquing your interest with your clients. Where am I stuck at? Do trainings around that and you will not go wrong. I'll tell you, one of the things that I did not understand in grad school that I wished somebody had told me was that you can actually do some harm if you treat OCD in the same way that you treat generalized anxiety disorder, that there's a more specific protocol for OCD that has been proven to be more effective. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. When we get caught up in, because like I just mentioned, that some of the taboo content can be really, really distressful for clients.
Right.
And they develop these beliefs that it's character flawed. It's a problem with them and who they are and their being. And if they're having an intrusive thought, and I'll just go with a really, really distressful one. What if I am the type of person who could harm children? Pedophilia OCD is really just so distressful for clients. And, if you are maybe doing let's get into that content. Where does that come from? We are offering validation and lending credibility to this thing that is purely out of the imagination. Right there.
Good point.
One thing I want to really kind of hone in on with OCD content is that there's nothing in the moment, in reality, in this moment, that says that this is real in any way, right? It's just a what if, it's a thought. So that means we are generating it out of our imagination. And then the compulsive behavior that we're doing is lending it legitimacy because we're doing a real behavior to change an imaginary situation, right?
Yeah.
But the situation is still just a story. It's just imagination, right? So we can't solve for it because imagination has no bounds and it is not bound by any logic. So when we're trying to logic through something with a client, we are just enmeshing them with the content. And, oh, if this professional thinks that we need to deal with that, then there is something really, really wrong with me, right?
Okay.
And so now we're just like really, really going all in on, you have to solve why you think this way. Well, no. Your imagination got the better of you because you're afraid, of your sense of self, like going against yourself, right? Like that's
Mhm.
really what the problem is, not the content. Does that
And that
make
makes perfect sense. And you mentioned ERP, and that is the treatment, the gold standard treatment protocol.
yes.
It is nothing we can get into here in a short period of time. It is an entire separate training, but I encourage you, if you suspect that you have a client that has OCD, do not treat it as you would generalized anxiety. Get some consultation, get some training, or maybe even refer out. I am not a specialist in this. I'm in Kansas City with Kari as well. I refer to Kari if I notice that that's coming up because I know I don't have training in that. So it's okay if you want to treat the clients, but get some training around it, get some consultation around it to make sure that you are doing no harm in an effort to help and heal.
Right.
Kari, as we are wrapping up, how
Yeah.
can people connect with you?
You can reach me via my website, KariGregoryLPC.com. My email is just Kari at that same URL. That's the easiest way to get a hold of me.
Perfect. And if you want to connect with me and connect with the podcast, counselingcommunity.com, counseling community also on Facebook and Instagram. And I want to thank Kari for coming on today. Thank you
Oh,
very
thanks
much
for
for being
having
here.
me.
And to all my fellow therapists out there, I hope you go out and you live your best dang life. Have a wonderful day.